Okay, guys, so today we're going to be getting into chapter 2, and we're looking at basically the history of punishment. And we're going to put this in a nutshell. When you look at the history of punishment, it really started out, this goes back to biblical times, all the way up until about the 1500s. It was very torturous. It was very mutilation minded. It was public. It was humiliating. It was intended to shame the individual. People were killed oftentimes for these, and the intent was that if we make these punishments so bad, people will not commit the crimes. Back in the 16 and 1500s, England had roughly 200 different crimes for which a person could be put to death. And we did them very publicly. And the more humiliating and the more torture they endured, we thought the better it was, because that was showing that we're going to punish these individuals. Well, crime rates still rose. We even had countries that were shipping inmates out to other colonies. England, by the way, did this, and having colony prisons. Georgia, the state of Georgia, was a colony prison. Australia was a prison. There were many other countries that were founded as nothing more than prisons. We also had, England was known for having what they called hawks. And what they would do is they would take these inmates, and this goes into the 1700s and 1800s, and they would put these inmates on these ships. And these ships were typically broken down ships that were located on the water. These ships were so old and would oftentimes be so overcrowded that they would actually sink. And they were known to kill hundreds of thousands of inmates by using these hawks. Well, in the 1700s, we start to see a change, and the change comes in the form of what we call houses of correction. And this is where we start getting into the idea of taking these inmates from torture to more what we consider today to be humane treatment. Bridewells were one of these, and what these were, we called them workhouses. The inmates would go in here and would work for specific times. And we can say these go up until about the 1700s, and then we start looking at other changes. In about the 1700s to the 1800s, we have a guy by the name of William Penn. He introduced the first penitentiary. Now, you have to understand the reasoning behind the penitentiary. It's called a penitentiary because it really depended upon penance. These were the Quakers. They believed that a person committed crimes because they were separated from God. And so the only way to get them back in a right relationship with God would be to separate them from society, would be to have them in solitary confinement in many cases, and give them biblical literature. And over time, that person would repent of their sins. They would come to know God once more, be in a right relationship, and they would be released. So the penitentiary actually started out as a religious reformation, not just a social reformation. And then we have other individuals that started influencing the penitentiary system as well. We have Cesar Beccaria and Jeremy Bentham. Now, these two guys caused a stir in the 1700s when they came about, because they were more free will minded. In other words, what they said was that we commit crimes basically upon our own free will, and we actually compare the pain and the pleasure that we get from our crimes, and that's how we make a decision. One of the things that they said was that punishment has to be severe enough to outweigh the pleasure of a crime, but it cannot be too severe. If it's too severe, then it's not going to have a deterrent effect. And Bentham was actually known to come out with several plans for how prisons should be built based upon this concept, but they never came to fruition because the plans were simply impossible architecturally. So they never came out. Then we come into the 1900s. In the 1900s, we start having other theories that have effect on this. Evolution starts coming around, and so we start looking at, okay, maybe free will isn't the only reason people commit offenses, and so we should punish them differently. So in the 1900s, we start looking at what are the biological causes, what are the psychological causes and sociological, and how do we rectify those in an individual, which starts leading us more into a treatment type of punishment rather than a punishment for free will concept's sake. Well, That lasts for probably 50 to 75 years. And then we saw society take another swing. And that's back to this idea of punishment. So in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we're very much into this medical model to where we're treating individuals. And then the public says, wait a minute, crime rates are still going up and we're having serious offenders. We need to go back into punishing these people. And that's kind of where we are now, is back into this idea of punishment. That's why our crime rates, even though they may be decreasing in some cases, our imprisonment rates are still going up. That's just a brief history. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A forum, or you can always email me.